Welcome, everyone, to the eighth episode of Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. As you already know, my name is Amanda Kelly. I'm the Junior Risk Consultant at Plan to Protect, as well as the host of these weekly podcasts where we're tackling topics of safety with a focus on achieving that highest standard of abuse prevention and protection for the vulnerable sector. So these sessions, they're geared primarily to parents, individuals, and organizations that are serving the vulnerable sector. So whether you be positioned at a school, a camp, a church, or another organization servicing the sector. A couple of weeks ago, we had a conversation about the choice that parents are facing come September with schools and daycares opening back up. So this week we're shifting a little bit to talk about children and grief. So today we actually have a special guest joining us, Cheryl Debanné, a mother of two, a spiritual care and community involvement animator with the Sir Wilfrid Laurier School Board in Quebec, and also a grief counselor for children and youth dealing with the issues and loss of a loved one, and developing tools and workshops for students and educators to help them better understand that process of grief among children. So, welcome, Cheryl. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here with you.
I'm really looking forward to diving into this topic. I have a lot of questions for you, so we'll buckle up. I think right now, especially grief in children is becoming this kind of hot topic, and maybe something that a lot of parents are really unfamiliar with navigating around. I know I am, but I think it's something that parents really, really need to know about and be able to deal with and support their child in the right ways, especially now. So, as a grief counselor for children and youth, have you been seeing a difference in the grieving process during the pandemic?
Well, yeah, just because, the reality here in Canada and again in the United States is that we're seeing an increase of people dying. 177,000 people in the United States have died of COVID, 9,000 in Canada, 5,000 just here in my province of Quebec. I have two friends who lost their spouses from COVID over the pandemic. And so, absolutely, people are understanding that death is more of a reality. I used to always talk about one in every 50 children are grieving at any given time. So that means that there's children in every school, in every community, in every church who are facing the death of a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, a friend, a close family friend. Sometimes it's a parent, a sibling. But during COVID, it's complicated the grief a little bit, simply because we couldn't do the family rituals that we've normally done with grief. In other words, when grandpa was in the hospital, even if it wasn't COVID, or grandma was in the hospital, the families couldn't go and visit. They couldn't go and see them. They couldn't go and say goodbye. And then during the funeral process, or the bereavement process, families couldn't gather. My own husband's aunt died, and we ended up having the funeral on Zoom. And so, in some ways, more people could come than normal because people in other provinces and places could join. But then it took away from being able to be together, and so it has complicated the whole grieving process for children.
So, have you been finding that children are feeling more anxious than normal, and could that be costed to the pandemic and the fear that's kind of been manifested around it?
Absolutely. School starts back here in Quebec next week. The teachers come back this week, and then next week the children come back. And I just see this as I walk into schools. I see this level of anxiety among the staff and among children. Certainly, parents are anxious. We hear, I've just been following all these blogs and all this news about what do I do? How do I do this? How do I process this? And children are just confused too. They're going back to a school that they've never seen before. There's going to be so many new rituals, so many new practices. And some of those children are grieving and have not processed or talked to anybody about their grief um, since March. Many of them have not seen their friends since that March. So a child who has maybe had the death of a loved one since March Their friends don't know anything about this. They haven't seen them. They haven't processed it. And then there's so many things that kids are worried about. What is going on with COVID? What's going to happen? Everybody talks about the second wave. Is it going to really happen? When's it going to happen? What does this no immunity mean? What does that mean to a kid? Kids don't understand that. They don't understand that why, here we know that this virus spreads quickly, and you can have it and not even know about it. And so children are thinking, do I have it? Do I not know about it? Am I passing this along? And people are being afraid, are afraid. This is gonna be pushed to them all the time. Stay away from your friends because you don't know who has it and who doesn't have it, who's carrying it. So kids are just have this level of anxiety going back to school, and it's the great unknown right now in the schools and what's going to happen. And I think everyone's feeling that anxiety, and that mixes with any feelings of grief that they may have.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult, especially because there aren't that many answers that we really feel that we can give because things are changing all the time, all the time, all the time. And so the information that children are getting could also be continuously changing. I know you mentioned that there will be some children returning that have already experienced loss due to the pandemic itself. Do children go through the same kind of grieving process as adults? Does it look different for children, even according to their age? What does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Children grieve. Absolutely, they grieve. They don't grieve like adults do. Thank God. I always say that. I always am very grateful to that, because I remember when my parents died, the grief that I felt was just unbelievable. And I would never want a child to have that kind of profound pain that we have as adults when we lose somebody we know love. But they do grieve, and it's always something I tell kids that this isn't something that you get over. It's not like one day you wake up and you're just suddenly over grief. It's something you get through and you develop a new normal. And we've talked a lot about the new normal when it comes to COVID. Well, there's a new normal that they develop after they've lost somebody that they love. And depending on the child's age, they're going to grieve differently. But grief is this intense emotional reaction to the loss of a loved one, or a loss of anything. We don't just grieve the death of somebody. We can grieve, and I think some kids are going to be grieving their experience, their school experience, their normal experience. I met with grade 6 students here in Quebec, kids who finished high school after grade 6, and they were grieving not having a normal graduation and a school trip and seeing their friends and finishing off high school, elementary school, and then moving on to high school. That's a grief for them. You can grieve losing something. You can grieve moving from one house to another. All those things are grief processes. At the same time, children grieve differently based on their ages. So little children, under the age of 2, say, they they don't understand at all about death. They don't understand the permanency of death. They don't understand what's going on. They can still experience grief, but more in terms of, I know something bad is happening in this home. Mummy's not the same. Daddy's not the same. Everybody's anxious. And so their level of anxiety and stress is going to go up just because something's not normal, even though they don't understand that it's grief. They don't understand that grandpa died or that grandma died. They just know that something's not normal. Um, Starting in the grade is young as grade 4, right up through mid elementary school. Children understand that, but it's all very mysterious to them. They don't necessarily understand that it's permanent. And so I've had children say to me, okay, my grandpa's been gone long enough. Can he come back now? Is he going to come back on time for my birthday? And if it's a parent who has died, then it really causes them a lot of stress in terms of, well, if mummy's died, who's going to take care of me? Or if one parent dies, they're very concerned about whether the other one's going to die. And so then there's a real anxiety about being away from the other parent. And so a lot of times it's really hard for them, even though they want to go back into the normal school setting, they want to be with their friends. Kids don't like to be not normal. And normal is going to school. And so oftentimes children go back to school quite quickly after the death, even of a parent or a sibling. Um, but then they're very anxious. They want to know all the time, where's that other parent? What's going on? Are they okay? And so I often encourage educators or teachers, please just let them be able to call home and check in and just know that mom's okay or dad's okay, and those kind of things. So they do understand grief. They don't necessarily know that it's permanent. In the younger grades, especially kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, as they move up into elementary school, they begin to understand a little bit more about death. And they're very curious about the whole process of death. They want to know what happens to the body. What do you mean? What is cremation? What do you mean, we're burying grandma? What's going to happen to grandma? That's, like, that's just weird that we would put grandma in the ground. They ask a lot of questions. And for them, death is death is death. So when I go in and talk to students about the death of one of the students that say they've lost their parent, I end up hearing lots of stories about, well, my cat died, my hamster died, and for them, it is as significant that they lost their hamster as Joey lost his dad. And so to them, death is death. And so they all experience that in some level. And then as kids get more into junior high, high school, it becomes very existential. They ask lots of questions about the afterlife. They ask lots of questions about what happens, what's the purpose of life, are we all going to die? And so they process it differently. As I mentioned earlier, kids do not grieve like adults do. I always say to families, kids sort of toy with grief. So they'll enter into grief, they'll feel it very profoundly, but then they can be easily distracted. So it could be that children, even at a funeral home, they would, you would see them be a little upset, but then, they would go off and run off with their cousin and be laughing and very happy, because they can't process the depth of the pain that adults would.
So I know, Cheryl, you mentioned that a child can be experiencing grief for more than just loss of an individual or from a death, but also could be just loss in general from a relationship. So what can we be doing for a child who is facing grief, and does that kind of support look different based on what they're grieving?
Yeah, I think it's important to realize, as I mentioned, that a child can grieve over a move. It can be over a divorce. It can be over the loss of a loved one through death. It could be, we can, and any number of things can be a grief process. One of the things that I think is really important for caregivers is that we make sure that as we're taking care of the children in our lives, the youth in our lives, we're also taking care of ourselves. We can't help somebody if we're also in that huge grieving process ourselves. And I think that that's what's really hard for parents, especially if they've just lost a spouse and they have children. I remember when I first took a plane when I had very young children, and I thought it was so crazy when the flight attendant came online and said, in the case of loss of pressure, put on your own mask before you put on the mask of your children. And I thought, what mother in their right mind would ever put on their own mask before they took care of their kid's mask? And it seemed so counterintuitive to me that, what? I'm never going to put it on my own mask. That's so selfish. But then I realized, if I pass out, that's it for my kids. I need to have my mask on. And so I think that as caregivers, we need to make sure that we're caring for ourselves, especially if we're going through the divorce, if we're going through the loss or the move, if we're going through the death of a loved one. And then as we're caring for ourselves, then we're caring for our children too. And I think that it's really tough for parents when they go through that grieving process to be able to take care of themselves and their children. And so many of them put their children first, and they don't care for themselves. And then that just delays their whole process. So yes, we need to be caring for ourselves. And then we need to be then reaching out and looking and seeing in our children's lives what's really going on. Children do grieve, and it is going to come out somehow. Sometimes it is going to affect them physically. So lack of sleep, and they're not going to be eating the same way. They're going to they're going to have tummy aches or headaches. It could be behaviorally. They say that close to 72% of kids who are grieving will misbehave in school or in church or on their sports team. It's going to come out somehow. Emotionally, academically, they have a hard time. Either they then become overachievers, or they just don't care about their schoolwork anymore. It can come out socially. I've seen kids who don't want to spend time with their friends anymore. Why? Because, Joey still has his dad and I don't have my dad. Why would I want to go over and spend time at Joey's house? It just reminds me that my dad's gone. And so they withdraw. And lots of spiritually as well, they question, how could a good God allow my mom or my dad to die? It makes no sense. And so they have lots of questions. What about the afterlife? What happens next? And so there's a lot of spiritual questions too. So it affects every area of a child's life.
So then what kind of support could we be providing? So whether it be like sitting down and talking to them, or if there are other methods a parent or a caregiver can be doing for their child.
I think it's really important that we're honest with children. Children can handle it better than we think. One of the first things I often tell parents and tell educators is to make sure that you're as honest as you can be with the children. And part of that honesty for me is using the word dead and death. We love to use these euphemisms, and we like to refer to death in something other than it actually is. Kids can handle the word dead, died, dying, far more than adults can. We often say so and so passed. Well, a kid doesn't get that. Passed what? I mean, this isn't a test, because frankly, we're all going to fail that test. We're all going to die at some point. Or we lost somebody. That's very confusing to kids, because when we lose something, normally if we look hard enough, we can find it again. When somebody dies, we're not going to find them again in the same way. So we first need to be honest with our use of words. And then we can also just tell them the truth about what's happening. And I think that it's really important to prepare children before somebody we love dies. That means going to the hospital and saying goodbye. That means using the words that this cancer is terminal. It means that grandma, grandpa, whoever it is going to die. It's just a matter of time, and explaining that to them. When I talk to children, I use what I call the three varies. And I say that people die because normally they die because they're very, very, very old. And, I'm old, but I'm not very, very, very old. And so normally that's the case. When somebody gets very, very, very old, they die. Our bodies give out. That's just the process of life. Other people die because they're very, very, very sick. And so cancer is a disease where people can get very, very, very sick. It's not the same as having a cold. And even with COVID, there are people with COVID who just are sick, but there's others who are very, very, very sick, and they have died of COVID. And so explaining the difference, even with the situation of the virus. And then finally, people can die because they're hurt very, very, very badly in a car accident, in a crime, in a shooting, in some kind of an accident. And so those are the things. And kids get that. They understand the difference between, daddy has a cold, he's sick. But grandma, well, she was very, very, very sick. And so I try to explain that, especially to younger kids. That seems to work really well. And then I, stay away from all those euphemisms I mentioned. I I really think it's important for anybody who's listening who works in a church setting. Um, I've heard some things that just drive me crazy in, in church settings when it comes to that. When my dad died, I picked up the phone and a man was calling me to tell me this. He was in Arizona. He was a friend of my dad's. And the words he used to me was, Cheryl, this is so and so. I want you to know your dad graduated to glory. And it took me a minute to think, what is he telling me? And then I realized that he was telling me my dad had died. Graduated to glory is not a good term to use with kids or adults for that matter. I've heard people say, God needed another angel. That's why they took your mummy. that just makes a huge problematic situation for kids. That that, well, why couldn't God make somebody else's mom his angel? Why did He need my mom? And so and not mention even the theological question of, do humans become angels and all that, but it just creates all kinds of anxiety. That God took your sister. So I'm very cautious when I talk in church settings about the language that we use around death. Um, and so to avoid all those euphemisms is really important. And then just as we're talking with kids, realizing that they're going to have all kinds of different thoughts and feelings. And it's just going to be a mumbo jumbo of these thoughts and feelings. Nothing's going to make sense. And so, as I said, they enter and exit grief really quickly. And so sometimes they're going to be feeling overwhelmed. Other times it's insecure. Other times it's panic. Sometimes it's sadness. Sometimes it's acceptance. Sometimes it's confusion. And it's just all these things. And we almost need, as caregivers, to dissect all these feelings and address one thing at a time, and not try to look at the whole picture, but how is this little boy or little girl feeling at this moment, and realizing that tomorrow they could be feeling something totally differently.
So I know that school is about to start again. So if there are some educators listening, what would some things be that they should be looking out for as children come back? I know that during this pandemic, there have been children that have taken it very difficult to be away from their friends, to be out of their routine, that there have been some children that have ended up committing suicide. Are there red flags that educators could be looking for, and caregivers, or just in general, what should educators be looking out for when the children are coming back?
Well, I think we need to remember that every child is unique and every child is going to grieve differently. And they will feel that loss. Some of them will want to express it and talk about it, others won't. And as I mentioned, kids want to be back in school. Many children are pressuring their parents. Parents are very reticent to go back to school, but um, the kids want to be there with their friends. They want normal. And school is a normal place for them. And so perhaps if there's been a death in the family, a home has not been a very normal place for them during COVID. If there's been violence in their home, if a parent has lost a job, if there's been an illness, if somebody's been hospitalized, all those things have made life not normal at home. So kids are anxious to get back to quote unquote normal at school. And so, as educators, we need to be looking for children who are perhaps expressing their grief differently. Grief will come out one way or another, behaviorally or loss of appetite. Um, but again, kids are all different. I find personally the boys in the schools have differ in terms of girls, in terms of how they grieve in the school. One of the things that I've found as I'm meeting with boys in school, um, they have a hard time meeting with me in the school. Why? Because they realize that in the room that I'm meeting with them, they could be crying, they could be very upset, and then they're going to have to go back out into the hallway. And what if another kid sees me? What if another kid can tell that I've been crying or been upset? And so that makes them anxious. Educators need to be watching out for that, for those things, and realizing that kids need to be able to express their grief um, through different ways. Some kids could come back and be acting out. That's just the way that they process the grief. That the grief, I always say, has to come out one way or the other. And so it could come out through aggression, it could come out through sadness, it could come out through tears. Um, but as I've said, kids go in and out of grief. They could be cyclical. They could go grieve for a very short time. And so I encourage educators, teachers to give the students who they know who are grieving a little pass. And they don't need to raise their hand and say, "Miss, I'm really sad. I need to call my mom." But sometimes it could just be a little note on their desk that they lift up, and it indicates to the teacher, "I need to go out into the hallway. I need to catch my breath. I need to check in with my mom." And so educators who have a child in their class who's grieving should have some kind of nonverbal process where they can communicate to that child, this is a safe place. I'm going to give you an out where you don't have to explain to everybody, I need to get up and leave this classroom because I'm having a moment. And so I encourage educators to do that. Um, I often talk to kids about grief being, I have two sort of illustrations that I use with kids, and I think that this is helpful for educators. For children, grief is a little bit like a roller coaster. They're going to have ups and they're going to have downs, and they don't really know what that's going to look like. But the other one I think is that is even more telling and more appropriate for kids, and kids seem to get this, is that grief is a little bit like being at the ocean, being at a beach. And normally the waves come in very slowly, calmly at the ocean, and it's everything's fine. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, in comes this huge wave that can knock you off your feet. And I say that to children, and they sort of say, "Yeah, I remember being at the ocean. I remember it being like that. That you can play in the ocean, and all of a sudden, a really big wave comes up." And grief is like that. They can be fine. They'll be doing their schoolwork. They'll be going through classes, and then all of a sudden, it's one little memory. It could be one word that somebody says. It could be a sound. It could be a smell, but something knocks them off their feet. And that's how grief is for kids. Something, and also for adults. I remember that myself, that something suddenly knocked me off my feet and I was sad all over again. And then you start the process and you go through it again.
So, as a caregiver, what can we do for a child or even a family that's facing grief?
So one of the things that I like to talk to parents and caregivers, children's ministers, educators, be prepared. And I think as we're going back into school, as we're going back into church ministry, as churches are beginning to meet again, um, as we're going back into our classrooms, be prepared. There are going to be children who are facing anxiety and who are facing grief. To know that there's going to be a child in your classroom. If 1 in 50 children are grieving, probably even more than that now with COVID, we're going to encounter a child. To be flexible, to not think that you have to teach every child, and every educator knows this, you don't teach every child the same way, that you adapt, and we have to adapt for grieving children as well. To be patient, to not try to draw those kids out and, tell me about your dad, tell me about how you're feeling, tell me about your emotions. Some kids just can't even put words to how they're feeling. To just be patient, to be consistent, to make sure that you're there for them, um, to just be silent, to just listen to what they have to say. There are so many times when I'm doing the grief counseling when the kid doesn't want to talk and I shouldn't be talking. And so it's just about being silent. I often have an activity where I can just color with them or, do something like that. And sometimes the kids, as they're coloring or doing an activity, a craft with me about that, a memory box or something else, then they'll begin to talk. And it's through doing something with their hands that they begin to process. To be a good role model, to talk about the loss that you've had in your life, to share your story, um, not in a comparison way, but to just make sure that the child knows that everybody is going to face grief at some point, and to be present. One of the things I really caution people about is when a family in a school or in a church is grieving. I've seen this done so often that we say, just call me if you need anything. And I really caution people to not do that. Um, it's enough for a family who's grieving to be grieving. They can't think of what they need to call to give it to somebody else. And so we as caregivers, we as people within the church, we as educators need to just do. We need to step up. We need to bring the meal. We need to help with the homework. We need to do the laundry. We need to go to the grocery store. We need to give the lift, whatever the case may be, but be present in that family's life when they're going through the grieving process, and not put the onus on the grieving family to contact us with their shopping list, with their to-do list, to be really present in their lives.
So, have you found in your experience that maybe some children have needed additional support, and in that case, what kind of additional support could we provide?
Yeah, there are times when children have very complicated grief, um, and um, and normally that is when there's unfinished business. If um, if they have been out of touch with a parent, so say a parent, there's already been a divorce, and then the parent dies. When the parent who dies had been in a bad relationship with the family, that can complicate grief. When the death is by suicide, that can complicate the grief. When there's been an inability to finish, if there's been some some issue that wasn't resolved, if you were angry, if the last words to your parent was "I hate you," or your brother was "I hate you," I wish you were dead, and then there was a horrible accident, those are all kinds of things that will complicate the process grieving process. And so it's important then, as an educator, as a parent, as a children's minister, as someone that's in the community, to make sure that that family is getting additional support. And most communities, there are certified grief counselors that you can make referrals to, and who will take the child to the next level, through their pediatrician. If a parent is listening and you're thinking, "Oh, my child is not processing this," if there's still seems to be unresolved things. And as I said, we never get over grief. It's not like one day we wake up and say, "Oh, okay, well, I'm better now." Um, we've sort of gone beyond within the grief counseling system that we don't do that. You don't go through these stages of grief, and then when you hit the last session or the last stage, okay, everything's fine now. But when time has passed and the person is still stuck, then it might be time to make a referral to a grief counselor and make sure you're getting additional support for your loved one.
Oh, thank you so much, Cheryl. I think you've really given a lot of insight into a topic that I found really isn't talked about enough and really isn't educated enough either. Just hearing this kind of information from you has even given me a whole different outlook on helping my own child, being going through the transitions of being in daycare, out of daycare, losing those relationships with their friends and what that looks like. I do think that here is a really good place to end, but before we go, I want to let our listeners know that this podcast is sponsored by the Plan to Protect Parent page. If you have not checked this out, it's a new initiative that Plan to Protect is doing to be targeting the questions that parents are needing, and to be able to provide that information to the parents and caregivers around times such as these, as well as protection and preventative measures that can be taken by parents. So again, if you haven't checked it out, the links will be below. You can see it on our Facebook page and also on Instagram. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel by hitting that handy dandy subscribe button below. Also, turn on your notifications by clicking on the bell so you get notified every time we post something different, so you can keep up with these really informative topics that we've been talking about. So thank you again to everyone so much that's been listening in, and a big thank you to our guest, Cheryl. So I hope everyone has a fantastic day, and thank you again. Take care,
Thank you.
everyone.